Okay, we're on the 1 o'clock. We're going to get going, and I am really excited to be here with you today and a stellar group of women on this panel. Welcome to this jobs.ac.uk webinar in partnership with Women's Space. And you'll know the topic. It's navigating the barriers and challenges that we face today in higher education. I'm Christina Hughes. I'm a professor of women and gender studies and have a very long experience of working in universities, having worked across 3 universities in senior roles. And I'm also the CEO of Women's Space, which I set up about a year ago to actually address the issues that we're going to talk about today. So again, welcome. Now, I'm sure it's no surprise to you to know that as the number of women decreases at every stage of the academic scale in universities, and we still face the underrepresentation of women in senior positions. We know that there are less than 2% of Black women professors in the UK, and we also know the impacts of the pandemic on women's research productivity, let alone the demands that they've experienced with homeschooling, with family care, and everything else that's happened as universities are switching and changing to try to grapple with the latest issues that we've been confronted with over the past 18 months. So our webinar today is going to look at how we can support you in your progression, and actually for me, very importantly, in how you can flourish in your careers and your roles. I'm going to now introduce the panel, and after I've done that, I'm going to encourage you to use the Q&A button, and then we'll go into some questions that have been pre-sent. So first of all, let me introduce the panel to you. So Abigail, would you like to start?
Hello everybody. My name is Abigail Gregory. It's good to be here today. I'm a professor of comparative sociology and researching gender equality and work-life balance in TV and film. And currently, I'm also providing institutional academic leadership for Athena Swan and gender equality at Manchester Metropolitan. I've held a range of senior academic leadership roles over the last decade or so. Director of Athena Swan, Deputy Faculty PVC, Faculty Head of International and Associate Dean International. And I'm very much looking forward to our discussion today.
Thank you, Abigail. Annette.
Okay, thank you. So, hi, my name's Annette Hay, and I work at Coventry University as a senior manager in our research services office. But as well as that, I also sit on a number of leadership roles in terms of committees and boards and councils, locally, nationally and internationally. I see myself as a Black activist who's passionate about tackling systemic inequalities and discrimination of all types, but especially racial inequalities in higher education. I'm also very committed to challenging current practice and perceptions through speaking up and speaking out whenever and wherever I can. And I believe in the power of collective action in all its forms that will help lead us to more accessible, representative, equitable and truly inclusive spaces for women. So thank you, Christine, and my colleagues for this opportunity.
Oh, thank you, Annette. Harula.
Hello. Hi, my name is Harula Zanakou. I'm a senior lecturer at Human Resource Management at Oxford Brookes University. I am particularly interested in how gender equality and diversity interventions can be evaluated and how they can disrupt or produce inequalities in organizations. I'm focusing mainly on higher education. I'm part of the Centre for Diversity Policy Research and Practice, and we're working at a lot of UK and European projects around gender equality and diversity in higher education, including the impact of COVID on inequalities, gender-based violence in higher education, structural change, and European certification for gender equality. I'm currently also leading a British Council project on mentoring Brazilian higher education institutions in advancing gender equality, and I'm hoping that some of these information would feed into the discussion today.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Harula. Now, we have woken someone up rather early today to be with us, and that is Cherie in the US. So would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Cherie Strawn. I'm a professor of political science and currently in an administrative role at Virginia Commonwealth University. And I'm a political scientist, and it's a very male-dominated discipline. So coming up through the ranks, there were all sorts of things to drive my attention to women and women's political participation, but also our participation at the university. And so, we've recently had some prominent Me Too incidents in academia, but also in political science in the US. So, we have problems that have not yet been fixed, clearly, still really prominent problems that haven't been fixed. And I would say that my own research, I wrote a book called Why Don't Women Rule the World, which is a textbook for women in politics. And I think the way that I approach this, both in my research but also in my own work, is one, to prepare women. How do I participate if I'm in a male-dominated role or male-dominated position? But how do we make the institutions change? I think we have to do both. So that's why I'm here.
Oh, that's excellent. Thank you. And yes, why don't women rule the world?
Well, I have to read the book.
Really good question. And we have another Cherie, this time in the UK.
Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. Very happy to be here. My name is Cherie Palmer. As Christina mentioned, I'm Cherie in the UK, so that's how I'll probably differentiate us when we're talking today. So I'm currently the Head of Access and Student Success at the University of Manchester. I have a particular interest in equity for all students and for ensuring students across all backgrounds to achieve their absolute best academically, whether they're from the most privileged or least privileged background. So I'm hoping my experience will be of interest today to those of you, for example, who might be considering transitioning from a different career. So I moved from secondary education leadership into higher education, took a massive drop down career-wise, so I can speak to what it's like to claw your way back up to where you were in your previous career and even higher. And I can also speak a little to intersectionality, so what it's like being a Black woman in academia, where we know actually, I believe only 20% of professors are women in this country, but I think we have something like 0.01% professors are Black females. Actually, reading an advanced HE report recently, it said 0.7 professors in HE are Black. So I can speak a little to intersectionality in relation to higher education, and really happy to be here.
Thank you, Cherie. And George.
Afternoon, everybody. I'm Georgina Ransley-Demora. I'm Professor of Social and Organisational Psychology at the University of Kent. I'm also Deputy Vice-Chancellor for Academic Strategy, Planning and Performance, and I'm responsible for university's academic units, strategic planning, marketing, outreach and admissions. But really alongside that, and what I'm hoping to be able to speak more about today, is I also do research into leadership, including women in leadership. And I'm the executive lead for EDI at the university. So really interested in the intersection between kind of theory and practice, if you like. So thanks for inviting me, Christina, and great to be here today.
It's great to have all of you. Honestly, it is. Now, just one more introduction, or actually a shout out, because they're sitting at the back of all of this and have been the most amazing people to work with. That's Jaspreet Singer, Emma Johnson, Paula Stapleton and Emily Nash, who have been absolutely assiduously working to bring all this together with me. And I couldn't have wished to be working with a better bunch of people. So thank you so much. I'm really glad to have had this opportunity. Now we're going to move into some questions and some discussion now, but please have a look at the question and answer box. It's on the top of your screen, or it should be. You can open that now. It's got two little voice boxes and a question mark. Post your questions in there. We will endeavour to address as many as we can, but we will take a record of them. And if there are any others that we can, get out there in more public ways to help other people, we'll have a look at doing that. So, okay, I'm going to start with our first question for our panel. And Harula, I'm going to start here. Based on your experience and, of course, your research, what do you feel is the main barrier to women's career progression?
Very good question to start. And a very, I would say, complex one. I would say main barrier, I think, from my experience, also from research, is that academic work has been actually created and for and shaped by men. And actually, the academic profession, while we see that it has changed over the years, we can see that still is not inclusive in its norms and in its practices. And I mean, you can see that from various examples of, the ideal worker rationale, that we're supposed to be working 24/7. There's an assumption about that to, mobility expectations, and networking as well, assumptions of who is a good academic or who is a good leader. And often we see that, there are particular images linked to who is a good leader, who is a good academic, are not, linked to women, I would say, and not to other actually groups. So I would, that would be for me the main barrier.
Okay, thank you, Harula. And from the US, Cherie, I mean, is it any different?
No, I mean, I teach that, I write about that in my book, right? That the institutions were created for men, and just even in my Women in Politics book, we talk about even just the physical infrastructure. Congress did not have enough bathrooms for women because we were not supposed to be there. Where's the lactation room? So if you extend physical infrastructure to all of the norms, all of the informal customs, all of the practices, and sort of the byways that have developed over the years, the institutions were purposefully designed to exclude us. And I think that, at least for me personally, that came to, I guess it was there in the background, but it came to fruition the most in my career when I chose to have a child. And then, we know that women hit a maternal wall. There's this expectation that you can be 100% dedicated as a scholar, sort of a monk-like commitment to your work. But we expect the same commitment of mothers to their children, right? Unvarnished dedication to your children as your sole attention. And when those two stereotypes clash, it creates what the research refers to as a maternal wall, and you will be hyper scrutinized because people will believe you're failing at one. No one will, in the back of their minds, they won't believe. And that did happen to me, and I hadn't read about it before. I didn't know how to prepare, and it really took me by surprise.
And any ways in which you experienced that and you managed to kind of get beyond it, or is it just something you have to live through?
Well, one of the things I did was switch careers because I wasn't happy with my colleagues at the time. So I actually wound up leaving for a different institution that was a little more family friendly. So they lost me. I mean, I see that as their loss, not mine. But if I could go back and do it again, I'm not sure I would change things because I was happy with my career after I left. At the time, it was painful, but I would just say you have to prepare to be hyper scrutinized at various points in your career where whatever you're doing as a nurturer or caregiver or those roles come into conflict with what people traditionally have thought of as academics. Prepare to be hyper scrutinized because someone will throw that at you.
Yeah, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Annette, of course, we know it's not just gender, pure and simple, don't we? So in terms of issues of race and ethnicity, what do you think are the main barriers?
Okay, thank you. Well, I think, certainly one of the main barriers is often people are and institutions, I should say, are resistant to actually looking at the intersectionality of race and gender. They tend to want to focus on one, and usually that one might be gender. And for many women of colour, or people from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds, that has been a challenge. And there's a lack of recognition of the diversity within those communities and those groups and the challenges. And so what often happens is that the benchmarks are often based on the experiences of white women. So not to deny them or to exclude those experiences, but those experiences are very different often to those of Black women, and sometimes women from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds. Sometimes it's at the on the receiving end of experience, things that have happened with white women. So I think it's that intersectionality. I think in terms of data, again, we're kind of getting a bit better at it in the UK, I think, in terms of how we collect data and how we use it. So again, we tend to do it in kind of silos. So you're a woman, you're a minority, you're gay, but actually, we're starting to learn now, aren't we? Actually, it's much more complicated and more complex than that. And I think in terms of how we collect data and how we use it, and then apply it to our practice is, I think, one of the biggest challenges, I think, for women, certainly in terms of women that are not white, but all women.
Okay, that's really great. And Cherie, is this your experience as well?
Yeah, I agree with what Annette was saying. And one of the things I would suggest is that women get involved as a way of effecting change. So it's very easy to become hopeless and think there's no point. But for example, I joined the Athena Swan Institutional Working Group at the University of Kent. I got involved in lots of different projects as a way of developing myself and also making things hopefully better for other women. So I think that's really important, because if you're not in the game, you can't have a voice. So I think that's important. But another thing I would say is it's very important to look for allies of any sex. So when I was, for example, obviously I went from secondary education into higher education, and my previous experience wasn't really recognised. So I took a role significantly lower. So I had to find a way, as I said, to move up the career ladder. And one of the ways I was able to do that was through creating a network. And in some ways I had a bit of a mentor. So there was a professor at Kent called Professor April McMahon, who is now Vice President for Teaching, Learning and Students at the University of Manchester. And she gave me my big break at Kent. So I approached her directly. I'd never met her before, never spoken to her. She was just walking past my building. And I was, quite lowly in position, and I just called out to her, and she was delightful. We went for coffee, and I told her my idea. She said, "Write me a proposal." And I did, and then she funded it directly from her budget. Now, that's really what got my career started. So there's something about identifying people that you think might have a connection to you. So in terms of your experience, your interests, aligning. So I think that's really important. Also, I have another colleague called Dave Thomas, who is exceptional. He now works for Advanced HE, but he was a very strong supporter of me, and he was someone that I could go to with when I met some obstacles. I could kind of run things past him. So when there were people, and sometimes women, who would try to, who would not, let's say, be supportive of me progressing, he would kind of encourage me and say, "You need to do this, and this is what you're good at." So I think there's something about having a team of allies in your institution, outside your institution, and in your personal life as well. So, they will say your five people you spend most time with is a reflection of you and what you'll achieve. So you want to surround yourself with some people who are moving forward, who are supporting you to be better in every way that's important to you. So I think when it comes to overcoming obstacles, it's your allies and your network that that plays a large part in your success.
Okay, that's really great. Thank you, Cherie. So barriers that we've just outlined: the maternal wall. So, when women have children, that really changes the game. The gender credibility, who is seen as a credible leader in very masculine and very white institutions, and the ways in which that plays out in a kind of myriad of ways, depending on your ethnicity, your sex, your age, your ability, etc., etc. So, George, You were talking about your responsibilities at Kent, and I'm really interested in the measures that you're taking there to address some of these issues of inequality, and if any of the solutions are looking to be likely to be very successful or even just useful.
Thanks, Christina. Definitely a learning curve. I'm really interested in to hear Annette and Cherie's experiences there. So I think from my perspective, it's working through some of these things being sort of ever changing. So I think we've now got some of the tools in the sector in terms of benchmarking that can really help us. So things like Athena's one that's been mentioned, Race Equality Charter, inclusive employers. There are various opportunities there, I think, for us to be able to use those benchmarks. And what they provide, I think, is that discipline around collecting data, doing the monitoring, doing the evaluation. It's all really important, and I think it has advanced things. I think from where I'm sitting there, and I'd be curious to know what the rest of the panel think, it's trying to navigate the space between having the data and evaluation, but also remembering those lived realities. And I think what we've already heard from colleagues who've spoken is everybody's experience is different, and we all approach certain points in our careers at different times and different challenges. Our colleagues, Cherie in the US talked about having, changing colleagues. I think that's really relevant too. So I think what we're trying to do at Kent is really kind of take a step out of that and think, okay, how do we make this everybody's responsibility? It's not someone else's problem. Actually, we all have an accountability, and how do we map into our own positions, what our accountabilities are and what our actions should be underpinning that. But it's early days, I would say, so it's definitely still lots of learning, and it's great to be having conversations like this because I think it is through that social connection that we can really learn from each other.
Yes, and actually recognising we all have a part to play. It's not just the institution or those people in that directorate or whatever who are going to be sorting it for us. It is important. Abigail, I mean, you've got extensive experience as well at the institutional level around these areas.
Yes, my feeling is that one needs to take a whole institutional approach to this and build an inclusive community. And that means a whole range of measures that might be taken, a number of which are very obvious, say in Silver, Athena Swan applications, successful applications. So that goes from policies to support carers, work-life balance, flexible working, ensuring that you have gender and ethnicity sensitive recruitment and career progression design. You have visible role models. You have staff networks to help to support various populations of your staff body. That you are using encouragement as well through the academic pathways, for example, encouraging academic research relating to your areas of concern. So there are multiple things, and training, staff development and so on, so that certain hygiene factors such as unconscious bias are addressed as well throughout the institution. If I had to choose one of those areas, I would say that, having a DVC like George, who has got EDI responsibilities, and having that sort of high profile door opening and inclusivity endorsement is absolutely key to ensuring that your institution can move forward in this space. So you can do incremental change, you can do a little bit here, a bit there, and try to take forward the institution, and change will happen gradually. But having that sort of top level endorsement and visibility is absolutely crucial.
Okay, thank you. And Annette, I know you're really active in this space. Any thoughts on institutional change?
Yes, no, thank you. Yes, I have been active in this space for quite a long time, and And thanks for the other comments. I agree with everything everybody else said, and something I feel, I'm not sure if we've come to the point where we've got solutions. We're working on solutions, I think. Hence, I noticed there was hesitancy in all of the responses in terms of, saying we've actually found solutions. But I mean, one of the things that I do is that I've proactively done is, because I feel like, leadership and governance and senior leadership and governance has been a key door into some of the, not just making the decisions, but seeing how the decisions are being made and influencing some of those decisions. So I've made it my, my job to get onto various boards and committees. So Advanced HE is one of them, who are responsible for the Athena Swan and for the Race Equality Charter Mark. And which are two charter marks that, at least they're doing some. I know there's some critiques and, it needs tweaking, and they have actually revised them. But I feel that they're really good in terms of helping people benchmark, in terms of making sure that, that so individuals and institutions have some form of accountability and responsibility and recognition for actually, because it's also about recognition for those institutions and those individuals in those institutions that are working, actively, whether it's the senior leadership or whether it's the people in the staff network or in the HR department. So so I sit on a number of boards, including Advanced HE. In my institution at Coventry University, I sit on a number of committees and boards, including around the Athena Swan and gender. And I'm also on NADAHE, which is the National Association for Diversity Officers in Higher Education in the United States. So I'm also a board member on there. So yes, I feel that's really good. And one of the things before, because I know you've got the questions, but I feel very strongly about positive action. So again, I feel that, which I know some people get confused with positive discrimination, but I feel very strongly about positive action. I don't think we have to wait years, for, to get this equality and, like it'll happen in 50 years time. No, there are things we can do, which is not about dumbing down. It's about, building up. And I feel there are things that we can do as a sector, as institutions, as leaders, to try and balance things up. I won't use the term level up because that's what our government's been using for all sorts of things, but I definitely feel that there's things that we can do. And just finally to say, I think it's great that we have benchmarks and we have these measures and we're doing all these things in terms of collecting the data and the lived experience. But it's really important that as institutions, as leaders, that we actually follow it through with action and we actually do something, because I think that's a lot of us has fallen victims who haven't we or witnessed where lots of statements are said, lots of there's lots of yes we're feeling you, lots of empathy, but then it's not followed through with the action. So yeah, that's my comment.
Yeah, thank you, Annette. I mean, the truth is, isn't it, that change is very slow. People get very demoralized because change is very slow. And actually, in many ways, we're also going backwards. So the impact of the pandemic on women more generally, and it's called a she recession, yes, or a C-session, does suggest that actually even some hard-won rights are constantly needing to be nurtured and looked after, because it's very easy for us to be actually going backwards rather than forwards. Okay, so we are going to now turn to some questions that you sent earlier, whilst the team is looking at the questions that you're posting up there and will be sending them to me. And I'm Harula, I'm going to ask you this one, and it is, I would like to progress into a leadership role. However, with the rise of remote and hybrid working, I'm finding it hard to network and seek out opportunities to raise my profile internally. Any tips on how to make yourself more visible? And I'm interested in what your research has told you, as well as your personal experience.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to start with personal experience. So I suppose there might be some overlappings. The first one is because with with a pandemic and everybody being online and social media actually becoming much more prominent, I would say I found that actually sharing social media, same channels with senior leadership team from my institution was very useful, because then I could in LinkedIn or Twitter I could post things that I was doing, so they could see that actually, you know, I was taking forward a lot of things and projects and stuff. And I think that was really useful. I can see, you know, from the likes that actually my dean is, you know, kind of like liking my post, and people from the, you know, leadership team. So I think that would be one first. Find out what social media channels they're using, and make sure, you know, that you're featuring them, just to understand, you know, who you are and what you're doing. At the same time, I would say also, I want to agree very much with what was said before about, you know, we're all in this together, and also our voice being heard. So I would say volunteer to sit in committees, you know, where the senior leadership team might, you know, be part of and might be chairing, especially when you're passionate about something, or you can contribute. So I think that would be quite useful in enhancing your visibility. I mean, in terms of research, I would say that I'm finding also in relation to institutional change that a lot of institutions now, which I think is a very good move, instead of, you know, patting people on the back and actually say, well, would you like to go for this leadership role? Now they have open calls for leadership posts. And I think that's a good, you know, that's a good shift, if you want, so that people are feeling like, right, okay, so there is this new leadership post, I can apply for that, and I can ask around and I can find out. I'm not saying, you know, of course the selection can be biased, but, you know, it's still a good first step if you want towards the right direction. So I would say that that is quite important. I don't know if the rest of the panel wants to add anything to that. I'm sure there are other things, but these are 2 or 3 things that came to mind.
Okay, it's brilliant. But I do have a follow-up, Harula, which is if someone said, yes, women need training,
Ooh.
would be your response?
Oh dear, okay. Right, so this might be a bit, how can I say, provocative, but I'm very concerned about promoting the idea of training, because I'm kind of feeling that kind of like there's an underlying assumption that we need training, we need to be fixed, you know, in order to fit to that world. And I don't think this is the case. I think, you know, actually training needs to be done from the organization's perspective. And actually there's need to be much more activities and actions on changing discourses about who should be an academic, who should be a leader, and actually, you know, encompassing and endorsing different types of leadership, different types of, you know, skills and abilities. And so I'm kind of like, I'm always very shy of actually, another training, you know. I reviewed an application of an Athena's one, and they were saying, we're going to confidence building workshops. And I was like, ooh, you know, that's not something I'm in favor of. I don't know, maybe the panel has another opinion, but yeah, I'm kind of, I would say no, it's just the institutions, you know, the systems need to be challenged, they need to be fixed, they need to take responsibility and change the way we see things, and how training is provided and to whom.
Yeah, thank you, Harula. Does anybody on the panel want to respond to that?
Just one very brief thing I would say as a woman of colour. So I think it's exactly what Harula was saying. It's a lot about being given opportunities. So I think people often tap on the shoulder those who are like them, remind them of people they know. So I think it's quite rare for people of colour to be given that tap on the shoulder where someone actually says, I think you'd be good at this, or have you considered? So I think there's a kind of challenge there. And also in institutions where women are promoted, it's easy to think that it's fine for women of colour because, well, we've got plenty of women in positions of authority. Do you have any women of colour in those positions? So I think that's something to be aware of. But when it comes to networking as well, I would say networking is a word that can make us cringe, but it's really just, I think, this is how I approach it. I'm just curious. I'm interested in understanding how this institution works, what roles people have at all levels. And I think that's the way to approach networking. So finding out more about different roles, different strengths, and seeing where you might fit so you can be more strategic about where you're applying and focusing your efforts.
Okay, that's really great. Thank you. Okay, another question. I have witnessed, this is not an unusual situation, frankly. I have witnessed situations where male colleagues with similar skill sets and job roles are being paid more or are on a higher grade than women in the same position. I have to say I met someone recently who discovered that her colleague was earning £10,000 more than us, so this is real, right? This is actually real. In addition, many have been more successful when applying for senior management jobs. And so if I ask you, Abigail, what advice could you provide to women who are trying to negotiate a fair salary or a pay grade?
Well, I also recognise that situation that you described, Christina. And it does happen in particular where someone is in a leadership role and part of their role, if you like, is leadership, but the other part is that they are on a performance-based pay scale. So they might be a professor, but they're also leading in a named role, such as an associate dean. And then I've certainly heard of it also, that you get disparities in pay, which results from the different positioning of the male and the female staff member on that pay scale. And some of that can be simply the fact that people have come in from other institutions at a different point on the scale, but may also reflect the fact that it's still the case that, and there's plenty of evidence for this, that men are better at negotiating their pay in the first place. And this is actually from graduate level, first job out of university. And then, of course, that goes on and is perpetuated throughout your career. And it's certainly the case that, say, a headhunter will ask you what your pay is, and your future employer may well ask you that as part of a recruitment process. And of course, then those pay differentials are replicated and over and over again. So how do you go about addressing that sort of thing? Well, obviously, you have to be pretty sure of your facts. In that sort of instance, and you might work with your line manager and draw their attention and ask their advice. In senior roles, obviously, that can be someone very senior in the university. And also, you may find that issue, if you ascertain this as being a gendered issue, could be taken to the chair of a promotions committee, for example, and that there may need to be an institutional review of the situation of men and women within those sort of performance-based roles. So that's one sort of set of answers, which is about the specific case that you are raising.
Yeah.
There's the more broad one, which is, men and women having similar skill sets, but women not being so further advanced. And that is a very broad, set of issues that we've been talking about really today, resulting in that situation. So I really don't know where to start, but you might start with, women putting themselves forward for the roles, because there's lots of evidence there that women are less likely to put themselves forward for roles than men. They're less likely to take a chance. They're more likely to want to meet all of the essentials, for example, before they put an application in. So, I mean, there's a whole set of things that we could talk about here, and I'm going to throw it open to the rest of the panel to interject here now, because, that it's very, very broad, that piece.
It is very broad. And actually a headhunter said to me once that HE might be very particular in terms of that I have to meet all the criteria because of the way in which we recruit, which does have all the, masses often of required criteria, let alone all the sort of optional, it would be nice if you did. And that it is not unusual for women to feel they've got to fill every cell of that list to be able to even before they start to apply. In the US, Cherie, your structures and your tenure is very, very different, and I'm really interested in how these kinds of issues work out there, and also that, women's, chances of securing a promotion in these environments?
Unfortunately, even though we have different structures and the processes play out, these are all sounding very familiar to me. And so we have a very similar leaky pipeline for women up through tenure and promotion. We have a leaky pipeline for women up through serving in administrative roles, and at the more intersectional identities you add, the worse it gets. And in the male-dominated disciplines like political science, philosophy, history, or the STEMs, so what does that leave women? English and women in gender studies, maybe? There was an active Me Too movement in education where there were enough women tenured, where they were actually sort of saying, this person harassed me in graduate school. And enough details came out that it did trigger an investigation. I know of like 2 or 3 senior prominent men who lost, they were allowed to retire, not lost their jobs, but were allowed to retire, but sort of pushed out. So that the point about Annette's point about collective action and, sort of being willing to stand up and try to change the institutions is actually really important. But then I would say that there is, if you can push, or if it's an institution with enough resources, there have been a handful of places that have instituted some of the changes that people were talking about. And I would say the most prominent is University of California at Berkeley.
Right.
They had a professor there, Marianne Mason, gosh, in the late 90s or early 2000s, wrote a book called Do Babies Matter? And found that her own institution, along with other US institutions, were failing miserably at promoting and advancing women. And so I think because they got called on the carpet by their own researcher, they agreed to implement some of her reforms, and she has post-reform data that it worked. So, it's not rocket science. We've been talking about the reforms since the 60s. We know the things that women need. We know the things that we want. And it's just a matter of what kind of pressure do you exert, or what kind of publicity, or what kind of internal role can you play to make those things come to fruition? Okay.
I mean, you just reminded me, Cherie, of on International Women's Day on Twitter. I don't know how many here saw it, but if institutions were posting about celebrating it, then there's a gender pay gap bot that clicks on. It was so powerful. I mean, absolutely so powerful. And it is that kind of direct action that really kind of calls out some of the things that still absolutely need to change, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's not rocket science. we just need the will to do what needs to be done.
Yeah. Okay, so I've now got some of your questions that have been sent to me from today. So from Katie Sewell, and this might be a question for you, Annette, or George. On a positive action point, are universities allowed to proactively hire people based on gender or race? On panels I've been on before, people are afraid of doing that for fear of legal consequences. They take the unconscious bias training, but then don't act on it. So Annette, do you want to kick off on that one?
Hi, yes. I think this is where the positive discrimination, the positive action sometimes gets conflated or mixed up or confused. So you can't employ somebody just because they're a woman, or just because they're Black, or they're Latino, or whatever. No, you can't. However, what you can do is you can make your the whole recruitment process more inclusive in terms of who you're targeting, how you're targeting, where you're advertising your jobs, how you actually, how you interview, etc. And then also when you're selecting and making your decisions, that can be influenced. If, for example, you've got, a number of candidates and that equally could be successful, but out of those potentially successful candidates, there's 1 or 2 that actually come from an underrepresented community or background, then you could reasonably and justifiably choose that person. That could be your selecting criteria, but you can't employ somebody just because of their ethnicity, their gender, or their background. I mean, somebody might correct me, but that's how I understand it.
That's great. Thank you so much. George, did you have anything to add?
I would have said exactly the same, but not as eloquently.
Oh, thank you. Okay, from Yusra Stiki, I continue to encounter versions, some more overt than others, of, just pin your ears back a minute, calm down, dear, in interactions with white male senior management. Do you have advice on how to navigate this effectively? Does anybody want to volunteer an answer?
Well, I can volunteer an answer.
Go on, Cherie.
So, I wouldn't call it necessarily formal training for women, but we do have informal networks where we anticipate, those of us that study it, if we anticipate things that are going to happen and there are women that want to be mentored, that has sort of been institutionalized. And so this is a technique that we teach women who are interested in running for political office in the United States, but it folds over to so many other places. You'll use it all the time, and it's name it, shame it, pivot. Because especially if you're in a position where you have any security, right? If you're tenured or you're in a position where they can't just, come up with a reason to fire you for not calming down, it's important to push back against that so that we eliminate the norm that that's acceptable and appropriate behavior. But you also don't want to belabor it, because whatever point you were making or whatever message that you were trying to communicate is in that moment more important to re-emphasize than having an elongated debate about whether that was sexist. So name it, that wasn't okay. You wouldn't, that's not an acceptable way to talk to me. I don't appreciate it. And let me continue on with my point. Right. So sometimes you need to practice that because it's jarring when someone throws a sexist or a racist comment at you. And with candidates, it could come from, a voter, it could come on the debate stage, it could come from another candidate. So practicing that so it's muscle memory, so that when someone does it, you can be swift enough to pivot back to whatever your main point was. Is what really needs to happen. So I would just say practice that in private in the mirror until it comes out smoothly. And if you're in a position where you feel secure enough, we've had reports back that's been helpful.
Okay, could you do a YouTube on that, Cherie?
I could try. Sure.
Post that out.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so one more question from Joseph Orm Dawson. Looking at the attendees list on this webinar, I think I might be the only male attending. Good for you, Joseph, good for you. And if there are any more chaps out there, thank you for taking the time to come. I think, yes, mandatory, is there any way to improve this? Mandatory CPD is a question he's putting forward. He's here to learn about barriers to education, whether this affects staff or students. Educating people of these barriers is key. I completely agree, Joseph, and this should be aimed at existing academics. Does anybody want to take that question about what we would call male allyship, or trying to get the message beyond women's groups so this knowledge is shared?
I think in some ways, Christina, it's George, sorry, in some ways it actually links really well back to the previous question. And actually, it's, as you said, it's some of this is being those active allies, isn't it? And if you see some of these bad things, you can actually promote the voices of your female colleagues or minoritized colleagues in meetings. And we have a natural human tendency to attribute good ideas to the most senior and generally male colleagues in spaces. So actually, if you can really take that attention and care and effort and engage in some of those active allyship, as you mentioned. And also, I think some of this is around that reality that I was talking about at the beginning. So I think, in a sense, if we do have men involved in the conversation. It helps with the inclusivity, but also helping to understand there are various different realities, and how can you share those outside of this sort of forum, and go and, you know, even if you go and just tell a few people, the ripples eventually make waves.
Yeah.
And you know, again, I think we probably have all had men and women support us in our own progression, and it is really powerful, I think. So
yeah. Thank you. Thank you, George. And from Sandra Walton, talking about imposter syndrome. So what advice would you be able to give to help women move into management leadership roles if they're thinking they're not good enough and not capable? I could spend an hour talking about this, but I'm not going to. Does anybody want to make a comment?
I'm going to come at this at quite an unusual perspective, I think, because again, I'm going to speak as a woman of colour. So I would say there's less of imposter syndrome and there's more other people will perceive I'm an imposter. So there's not feeling you're an imposter yourself, but there's a realization that many people think you shouldn't be in that role. You're undeserving, or perhaps they assume that you were given some sort of helping hand. So I think that is quite a challenge. And I think in that case, that's again why it's very important to have a network, have our allies, and obviously, of course, to do your work, to be involved in development opportunities, so you're constantly improving. So I think that one of the most important things, if you want to progress your career in higher education, is actually to make sure you're engaging with the right networks, that you're reading information, you're understanding best practice. You know, you're following Wonky, spelt Wonk H-E. You know, if you're in professional services, AUA, the Association for University Administrators, are you seeking fellowship of advanced HE to progress your career? Who could you reach out to learn more about a particular area you're interested in progressing in? So I think as a woman of colour, that is one of the challenges for me. I had a conversation with a friend who works at Bristol, and she was asking me, what's it like to be, you know, a black or BAME person in the world of work? And I was amazed we hadn't had that conversation before, because I've known her since I was at school. And she said to me, is it like being a woman? And I was really shocked that she thought that being a person of colour is as easy as being a woman. Because personally, I have to say, I don't really believe that the fact I'm a woman is a huge barrier for me. That's my personal experience and opinion. No, that's my personal opinion, but it's only relative. It's relative to what it's like being a person of colour. So I know there are clear barriers and challenges for women to succeed in higher education. But from my point, if I can be completely honest, that is as nothing compared to the challenge of being a black woman in the world of work and in higher education. So probably not the response people were expecting, but that's one of the reasons why I think I was invited on the panel to give this intersectional perspective. So I hope that's useful for some of you listening.
Yeah, really helpful, Cherie. Thank you. Okay, we are coming towards the end now of the webinar. So I'm going to wrap up by inviting each panelist to just offer us their top tip. And I'm going to start with Annette.
Okay, well, yeah, you've asked us to be brief. So I think my top tip would be to take more risks, you know, but always take these risks, but, you know, but stay being authentic and keeping it real and being yourself, and don't be afraid to be yourself. I know somebody just talked about imposter syndrome. So, yeah, I think take more risks and have a good support network, and, yeah, stay authentic and real.
Thank you, Annette. Thank you. Abigail.
I would say focus on what you can do rather than what you can't. Generally in your interactions with people, but of course when you're applying for roles. And in general, don't lead with your weaknesses. It's something that women often do, and it's very disempowering.
Yeah, thank you, Abigail. Harula.
Sorry. Top tip. I think, what we're discussing about navigating the barriers and challenges of higher education shouldn't be an individual's issue, but I think, it should be an issue that we try to work together to address collectively, working with institutions, with other stakeholders. And also, I think, I think it was mentioned before, we're all in this, and everybody should take responsibility and challenge norms and practices, intervene when we observe daily injustices and microaggressions, just to making sure that actually workplaces can be nurturing, but also, can feel like everyone can belong.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Harula. George?
So top tip from me would be, I think it's really a tendency we have, because we're so busy, to focus on our own teams, our own universities, our own sort of, what we're up to at the moment. And I think it's really important to just take the time to lift the head up, have a look around at external networks, formal and informal. And certainly from my experience, some of my eureka moments have been in when I have been engaged with colleagues outside, as I say, either formally or informally. So that's my top tip.
Okay, thank you. And from the US, Cherie?
So just from my own personal career experience, I would say prepare to be hyper scrutinized. That at some points in your career, you need to have ready answers or explanations for what you've done and why you've done it, whether that's a tenure case or whether that's an administrative decision as a leader. Because if those stereotypes about capabilities clash, you will be hyper scrutinized. So prepare for it, but also know that's why we have imposter syndrome, because we are hyper scrutinized and asked repeatedly to, say it again, prove it again. And that kind of constant attention can erode our self-confidence. And so use those mentors, use your own stealing your, preparation to stop the imposter syndrome in its tracks and say, I know why this is happening. I've prepared for this. And and move past it. And then when you are serving in those administrative leadership positions or do have more influence at your institution, make sure you're applying the same criteria to everyone, right? And haven't internalized that and flipped it back on people, so that we can change the institutions through our own efforts. So those are my advice.
Brilliant, thank you. And Cherie?
I have to. Oh, that was so beautifully put, Cherie, and such great comments from the panel as well. So I'll just summarise by saying, this links into what George was saying before, be strategic in the programmes and activities you get involved in. There's a tendency, as Cherie was just saying, to overcompensate. And I think to stretch yourself too thinly because you're trying so hard to prove yourself. So what that means is if you get involved in everything, you do nothing really well. So what you want to do is, and someone else was saying, I think, Abigail, don't focus on your weakness, focus on your strengths, develop your strengths, develop your network, develop your knowledge, keep working hard, and choose projects that will advance you towards your goal. Good luck.
Thank you, that's great. And as chair, I'm going to have the last word on top tip. And my top tip is embrace your justified anger. We know that things aren't right and they're not fair and everything isn't equal. And it is perfectly understandable and even more acceptable to feel that there is justification if you feel cross and annoyed by it. Okay, so just to conclude, if you're looking for more information on any of the topics from today, then please visit, and I've popped it in the Q&A box, jobs.ac.uk /career advice. And also, I'd love you to contact me. So if you went to www.women-space.co.uk, you can sign up and subscribe for lots of updates and newsletters, or email me at christina@women-space.co.uk. The webinar, as you all know, has been recorded, and that will be available next week on the Jobs Act UK's website. So please look out for that. Please share it. Please spread the word. Please support each other and amplify each and other's achievements. Of course, follow us on social media and check all those websites. So it just leaves me to say, on behalf of Jobs.uk and Women's Space, I'd like to thank you, our fantastically generous audience, and our panellists for their time today. And thank you very much for listening. We hope you found it helpful. Thank you. Bye.